Hello, everybody. For me, it's the first time in your network. And when I promised to Alexander that I will make a presentation, I didn't knew that it's researchers, scientists, and so on. I thought it was students, maybe PhDs. But don't worry, I learned that it's not students, maybe some PhDs. So I made a presentation within 2 or 3 parts. One part is to spell out a little bit what is the perspective of sociology of work. And since I was clear, or I learned that most of you are from other disciplines than me. And since I like very much working interdisciplinary, and since I know that you have to be very explicit in the way you are thinking, in the way you are researching, in the way you are conceptualizing problems and so on, I think it's very important to do it very thorough and very clear in the beginning. And then I will really talk about workplace democracy, the issue of democracy, and I will do it based on empirical research I've done together with colleagues. One part of the research is pretty old, starting in the 90s, reaching into the 2000 years. And this is one part. This is the issue of group work, of innovative work policy. And the second issue is a very recent one. It's digitization at work, research we are doing on this issue. And because in both of these research lines or research fields, we have a very similar and very interesting result for finding for the debate and the discussion about workplace democracy, I thought it makes sense to present this to all of you, and there will be enough time to discuss the things. I will, wait, I have to do it here. Oh, wait, it's a problem. I'm just looking how to go one step further in the presentation. Maybe. Do you see the presentation?
Yeah,
yes.
See the slide yet?
Yes, okay. I can't see you now, that's bad. Okay, I'll go back once just to make sure that I can see you. So now it should, work. Now you see everything. Okay. I will make the presentation in 3 steps. The first step is about sociology of work. To be fair, it is more about German sociology of work. And the second step is some conceptual remarks on workplace democracy. And then the third part will be empirical findings around group work, teamwork, and digitization at work. And there will be a short one-pager as a conclusion for our discussion. And I'm prepared that you will get the chance to ask questions, informations, and so on even after the first part, and then we will discuss everything together. And at the same time, since we are not that many people, we can also organize it that way. If you have any questions, just take them. It's not disturbing me. It will be no problem for me if you have a question. Okay, 3 steps, as I told you, and The first step is a bit about sociology of work, our perspective on the issue of work, on the issue of workplace democracy. The points here hopefully are somewhat familiar for you, so I just mentioned them. German sociology of work, at least a lot of German sociology of work, is a kind of combination of basically Marxist labor process analysis, but more in the sense of Paul Thompson and not that much in the sense of Harry Braverman. Most of, not just myself, but most of my colleagues have an element of critical theory. The concept of critique is very important in sociology of work in Germany. And the third point, and that is maybe the biggest difference towards Britain and some other countries, a lot of German sociology of work has a very hermeneutic approach in the analysis of work and in the understanding of work. Not only for me and the Sophie, but also for a lot of my colleagues. Popitz and Barth are important figures. You don't know them. If somebody of you knows one of these two very important sociologists, it's good, but it's don't wonder if you don't know them. What does labor process perspective mean? Basically, from the sociology of work perspective, it is important to understand that the labor process and work has a double or dual nature. And in Germany, we can't differentiate. We have only Arbeit. In British and American language, we have labor and work. It's for this issue, it's very perfect to have these two different concepts, because then you can say that the double or the dual nature of the labor process or work has on the one side the concrete use value of work. There it's work. It's about tasks, about functional technical requirements. This is the use value of work that is done. But the second nature and the second part of the sociology of work is that labor, and there comes labor in, work also has an exchange value. It's an issue of valorization of work, and therefore it's labor. So this is a labor process part of this dual nature. With the labor process part comes the transformation problem. Since some of you are French or have at least a bit of French background, Cornelius Castoriadis, he has a similar concept when he points out that work always has this double situation of being included and excluded from the company, from work, and so on. The transformation problem basically is connected to the issue that the labor power, the ability to work people have, has to be transformed into real labor, into real work, into effort, into activities. Since the labor contract, of course, is incomplete, that's a link to the economists who have the same idea about labor and work. And the transformation means that work organization is important, management concepts are important, technologies are important. These are the areas of the tools of transforming labor power, the possibility of labor into concrete labor, into concrete work. This is the labor process part of the background. The hermeneutic part of the background, or you can also say interpretative sociology, as a more international concept, that means on the one hand that subjectivity and even intersubjectivity is inevitable. You have to be subjective, you have to be intersubjective at work, since we are human beings, as far as human beings are working. This is one point. The second point, which is very important, is that it has a developmental or an appropriation perspective on work. I sometimes put also the German expressions on the slides because appropriation has, of course, very different meanings. Here it is from the beginning Hegel concept of Aneignung. Most of you might know Axel Honneth and other people working these types of concepts or explaining these types of concepts in modern social sciences or in modern philosophy. And this is an important part of the hermeneutic approach, that developmental and appropriation perspective on work is important from the perspective of the human beings. Wolfgang Weber is not here, otherwise I could tell him that it's very similar to job crafting in modern psychology of work. And the second point is identity-based sense-making in negotiated order, following, for example, Anselm Strauss. This is a very important concept behind this hermeneutic approach, or to put it more general, interpretative sociology. To be more precise, what the Sophie approach means, and because the Sophie has a long tradition, not all of my colleagues are working exactly with this approach, but it is, well, it's a very common approach here at the Institute, and not only here, there are also other sociologists of work in Germany working from a very similar perspective. So it's not only about Sophie. First point I already mentioned in a way, that the material conditions and the purpose of work, task characteristics, types of works are very important in our analysis, both for understanding what is going on in the field of work, but also for understanding dynamics in working life. A very important concept for us is Arbeitsanforderungen, which means what are you supposed to do? But not only because of management wants something from you, but because the process wants something for you, to produce something, to teach somebody, to do a care job, for example, to assembly a car or something else, a machine tool, to do maintenance work. All these are different tasks, different activities, and this matters in our analysis when it comes to how work develops, how is work understood, how work is done, and so on. This is the first point. Second point is what we in Germany call the work policy turn, Arbeitspolitische Wende. It started in the late 70s. It became very clear in the 1980s. Work policy turn means that there is no economic, technological, or labor process determinism in the development of work, but work policies matter. There are a range of specific business models, management concepts, sometimes competing, sometimes coexisting, co-evolving. This is one point. It has a focus on actors, conceptual ideas, strategies. Basically, it's a strategic choice perspective on society, on reality, and actor constellations are important. Who is in which position towards whom, and what are these constellations? This is the actor side. And finally, politics in production, politics of production. If some of you is working on knows Michael Burrows' conceptualization, this is important too. The work is embedded in capitalist varieties, is embedded in institutional logics. It's not only happening in the work process inside firms, but it's heavily influenced by capitalist variety on the one hand, institutional logics on the other hand. Third point is when it comes to employees, how they understand themselves, society, work, the firm, even democracy. It is important to have to understand or to conceptualize it again from a double or a dual perspective on work and labor. This concept of Arbeitskraftperspektive versus Subjektperspektive that is really developed at the Sophie this dual perspective means that every human being, when he or she is working, has a labor force perspective, an instrumental orientation towards work, effort-based, economically thinking, an understanding of work that he or she is selling labor, and he or she wants a good price for this selling of labor, and he or she don't want to work too much for the price, and so on. This is this labor force perspective, which everybody has, from our understanding at least. But that's not the only perspective. At the same time, this is important, at the same time, every human being, when he or she is working, has an identity perspective. That's the Subjektperspektive. He or she is acting based on social and personal identities, wants to get at least some sort of self-realization, of development inside work, get social recognition, and again, appropriation, Aneignung, has the approach to really get inside work, learn work, develop themselves by working, and so on. Although everybody knows, of course, that there are a lot of jobs which give very little way or possibilities for doing this. But the point is, every human being, when he or she is working, has this dual perspective on work. Last point is, what does working mean? And working from our perspective means handling materials as well as situations. Situations is a bit difficult in English and the American language. For German sociology of work, it's a very important concept. It's basically, it goes back to phenomenology, to hermeneutics, and so on. So working means handling materials on the one hand, handling a situation on the other hand. For example, as a care worker, you are also handle materials, but it's more a situation you have to cope with, you have to react to. And so working means coping with demands, problem solving, responding to challenges. And these challenges are often intertwined by, again, work and labor. You always have this double view on what's going on. So again, it's a use value oriented aspect of work and the valorization aspect as an element of the labor process. I translated a bit Popit's Bart. It's a very famous classical study of German sociology of work, where they say that working means answering towards a specific challenging situation. For those of you who can read German, it's the German is down there. And what is very interesting in this book is that they, by a footnote, connect this idea, so it's in the 50s, to Toynbee, the concept of challenge or response on the one hand, and in fact, actually also to pragmatism and to the Dewey form of developing Hegelian philosophy into pragmatism. They make this connection, Popit's Bart. This is a purely empirical study on steel workers in a steel factory, but this is the concept. Working means answering towards a specific challenging situation, and answering always means there's not just one answer. You have a bit of chance to give your answer towards a problem which is posed to you by the firm, by the work process, and so on. So that is everything I want to tell you about this basic ideas, conceptual ideas of sociology of work. When it comes to methods, it's very easy, very clear cut. We are working mostly with comparative case studies, in-depth methods. That means interviews, workplace observations, also questionnaires. I've put on the slides some figures for you later on, feedback workshops. So it's a very mixed methods approach we have, but the base of this mixed methods approach is qualitative research, comparative case studies. So democracy and work, second step. I just prepared one slide to conceptualize on the one hand, and to maybe for a base for our discussion later on. Democracy and work, the issue is, I suppose most of you know, there was a lot of discussion, both politically and scientifically, around this issue. These discussions sometimes were very strong, very fierce, and for example, about does it make sense to talk about democracy in the domain of work? Does it make sense to talk about democracy in the domain of work under capitalism? And these are the discussions that has been on and still are on in a way. And I think it's important, at least for my understanding, it's important to differentiate between three types of democracy and work, or three levels of democracy of work. The first one is economic democracy. In German, it's Wirtschaftsdemokratie. It has a long tradition, starting in the Weimar Constitution. It's focused on the economic system, on property relations, ownership of firms. In the Weimar Constitution, Wirtschaftsdemokratie was organized also in the way of regional or sectoral councils that should control and administrate area of the economy. That doesn't really work out because of a lot of political and other things, but this is the basic idea of economic democracy, of Wirtschaftsdemokratie. The second point is industrial democracy. Actually, in Germany, we don't use the word industrial democracy. In Scandinavian countries, it is used, but in German language, German-speaking countries, it's not that common to use the expression, but I think it's most useful for the international debate and discussion. In the German context, this means co-determination, employee representation in firms, on boards of firms. It means works councils. It means the Works Constitution Act, which is an act in Germany. So in Germany, it's a lot about Mitbestimmung on the one hand, Betriebsverfassung or Betriebsverfassungsgesetz on the other hand. That means this level or this type of democracy, which might be labeled as industrial democracy. The third point, and this is the point we are talking, or I'm talking about later on, is a workplace democracy. If you take it from the German language discussion, you might end up with the concept of Mitbestimmung am Arbeitsplatz. And this was a concept started in the late 60s, was under discussion again and again in unions, on the union side, on left intellectuals and so on. Just now, it's not a lot of discussion about Mitbestimmung am Arbeitsplatz. It's a fairly old concept, but the issue of workplace democracy is still on in a way. And what does it mean from thinking from these three levels? Workplace democracy is focused on the workplace. It means self-organization in the organization of work, the real doings people are doing in work. It means employee involvement, and this will be one of the points I will go a bit more in detail in, is it means group work based on group meetings, discussions, elected spokespersons. If some of you are at least a bit familiar with the management discussion and lean production discussion starting in the late 80s and influencing all Western countries in the 90s onwards until today, the teamwork and the group work discussion was very much influenced by this lean production concept starting in the 90s. And group teamwork was an important element of this discussion. But it is very interesting to see that in this concept of Mitbestimmung am Arbeitsplatz, dating back to the late 60s, exactly the same things were mentioned, although in a interesting different way as in the lean production concept. So if you have any questions to this conceptual background, you might do them now. Otherwise, I will go to the third part, the empirical part in a way, workplace democracy, what is important, what do we see, and what's on there. But maybe there's one. It can take some minutes just to make clear for the understanding. Yeah. Do you moderate, Alexander, or should I do?
I mean, it depends. If you, I don't see everybody right now.
Philip Steer raised his hand.
Yeah, maybe.
Better. Maybe, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, maybe just briefly, I wondered what's the element of critique then in this whole approach? Because you mentioned Axel Honneth and Horkheimer at the beginning. And maybe you could elaborate a little on the normative background to this.
Yeah, it's that's lucky. I already imagined that this question would come. Critique means, on the one hand, it's a specific type of critique because it's related to the Frankfurt School tradition. Basically, critique means criticizing what is happening, looking for better solutions, looking for maybe more democratic solutions, and so on. Criticizing what's going on. That's very simple critique. The Frankfurt, or one element of the Frankfurt tradition, which is part of or which influenced very much German sociology of work, is the idea that you can't sketch out the future. You can't say that's good and that's how it should work and that's how it should develop. But you have to look very closely on what is going on, and by having a sense of what people are saying, what people are doing, how people suffer from work, and how people themselves criticize work. This is the perspective you have to take. It's just not a normative utopia here to go, but it's going into the process, looking on what people are saying and doing and developing the elements of critique from this. This is the basic idea of critique, at least in my research, and that's also common in German sociology of work.
That's very helpful, thanks.
I think Roberto raised his hand too.
Yeah, it's to invite you to make a sort of, maybe I'm just anticipating something you will say later, but knowing your work, I think that from the standpoint of at least political theorists and political philosophers, your distinction in three level as an element which may be difficult to understand, which is that you place works councils, for example, in industrial democracy and not in workplace democracy, because I think this is because you give this strong emphasis to the democratizing potential of the organization of work, which is somehow something which is typical of a sociological approach and that you don't find so often in political theory. So, I mean, if you're going to talk in detail about this later, don't say anything now, but otherwise I think it would be useful to say something more about this democratizing potential of this dimension you focus on.
Yeah, I will, in the conclusion, I will in some way come back to this issue. Just to make it maybe a bit more clear just now is there are councils on the level of economic democracy, but these are regional or sectoral councils. These are not firm-based councils or site-based councils or plant-based councils. Industrial democracy always, at least from this conceptualization, means firm-based representation. And the third level, workplace democracy, this is not an issue of representation. Representation or representational democracy is an issue on the economic democracy level and on the industrial democracy level. On the workplace democracy level, it's It's a first person. It's you and your colleagues, you yourself are doing things. It's not an issue of representation. So there's this is the difference in a way. So it's and this is an important difference, but we can come to this later on. Okay, so Stefan Berger. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, if I may, just briefly, because I was intrigued also by like Philipp Steher on the word of critique. And of course, as a historian, one always thinks immediately of Reinhard Koselleck, Kritik und Krise, where he shows in a way critique as a central element of Enlightenment discourse, which is aimed at undermining the feudal society and is ultimately then responsible for bringing about the French Revolution. Now, in the tradition of the Frankfurt School, of course, critique is often used to undermine capitalism. So it is immediately related to an anti-capitalist critique.
Yeah.
So in that sense, your question also about the relationship of capitalism and democracy is an interesting one, in the sense that you know, is in a way workplace democracy making capitalism more efficient, as in the kind of ideas of the 80s that you mentioned, or is it undermining capitalism? That seems to me a kind of basic tension inherent in the critique notion.
Absolutely. This is a huge part of the fierce debate around these issues. It's exactly about this point, and hopefully I will make in my next 10 slides or so an argument for that it might coexist. It might have well, it's a practical critique which will not change capitalism. I'm not that convinced that that will be possible for a long time to go. But it's well, I will show. But Reinhard Koselleck is a good point, because Heinrich Popitz and Hans-Paul Barth, they said thank you to Reinhard Koselleck because he went through their book for publication. I don't know which traces that left in the book, but maybe it's just by accident, but it's an interesting accident at least. Okay, so here we go for empirical sociology of work. And
Martin, you have a question in the chat.
Oh, I don't see this. I see, there it is.
Okay, so. Well, in Germany, we have a real split between sociology of work and sociology of organizations. It goes back to social theoretical, because basically sociology of organizations was heavily influenced by Luhmann and functionalist sociology. That was a long time ago, and it's not the situation nowadays. It's completely clear. But and the sociology of work always was Frankfurt School, critical, and so on. Therefore, there is a big split still today in German sociology of work on the one hand, organization on the other hand. These are different departments in the sociology still. But when it comes to the issue and to the problem and to the topics we are talking and dealing with, then the difference is not that big, because in this concept of work policy, that there are different managerial concepts competing, co-evolving, coexisting, that's exactly organization. And the issue of actors, you have different actors, and the actor constellations are important for what's going on. It's again organization. So practically the differences is not that big nowadays, but historically it has been a real schisma between sociology of organization and sociology of work, but not today. But
it has some traces still today. Philip Reich, yes.
Yeah, sorry, but I have to go back to the point before, because I'm still not sure if I got this right. Maybe partly because I'm also a historian, and I think we have a different understanding of workplace democracy, or maybe we use it more interchangeably with the other terms. And I had the impression that what Stefan just mentioned as critique in your model goes into 1 and 2, and 3 in a way stands for all the measures that corporations have introduced to respond A, to economic challenges, and B, to social challenges like critique and criticism coming from social movements or labor movements. Is that a fair assessment of? Or?
No, absolutely. But it's a good point. But it's I can explain one point from this point, because in the sociology of work perspective, it's absolutely, this is a managerial view of the world, that there are problems, and by a specific work organization you can solve these problems, because the level of the importance of critique, the level of critique, and so on, is on all 3 levels. Because workplace democracy means against authority, against effort bargaining, and so on. So there's a lot of critique also on this workplace level. And you can't say that, well, critique and so on is only on this level 1 of the economic and industrial level. But we will look at this level now, and then we can discuss later on. But to start with, for me it's very important that that the specific management thinking has this idea that by having human relations in a proper way and so on, by doing this, you can circumvent all these splits and conflicts and so on. But that's absolutely not the case. You have the same conflicts, the same problems, sometimes even bigger problems and tensions on the workplace level. Okay, so here we go. 2 parts. First part is findings on group work, democracy at work in the context of group work. Here are the 4 points I want to make, and then I will show you some figures and so on. It's telling you some stories, but the points are the important ones. First point from this group work research is that there are different types of group work. Different types of group work means groups and the organization, work organization around groups may be more or less Tayloristic. There may be more or less group self-organization. The authority the group has by itself, or the authority that management has over the group, might be different. There is more or less employee involvement, more or less employee influence. So there are different types of group work. This is one of our findings. Second point is that there are really huge differences. I will show some to you afterwards. There are really huge differences along these different types of group work when it comes to the work situation, working conditions, when it comes to worker solidarity, team climate, relations at work, and that's even more important for our discussion, there are huge differences how workers themselves evaluate the possibility for participation, the level of democracy at work. This is connected to specific forms of work organization, to specific forms of group work. This is one of our results or findings, which is very important for the debate about workplace democracy from my perspective. Third point is that democratic practices are very important for explaining the differences between types of group work and for explaining the effects on work situation, solidarity, and so on. So democratic practices are very important to explain why these differences exist, two things are very important. One point is elected spokespeople instead of team leaders. One concept of group work or teamwork is based on team leaders, often appointed by management, and the other type or form of group work is based on elected spokespeople. So electing people as a democratic practice is part of these specific forms of group work. And the second part, which is important for the findings mentioned above, is that there are group meetings, that the group has time, possibility to meet and to discuss, and especially the character of these group meetings. Are they discourse-oriented? Is there deliberation, and so on? So these two democratic practices make a difference. Electing spokespeople, electing team leaders on the one hand, and the character of the group meetings on the other hand. And second or last point is that these democratic practices, as when they are part of group work, they are an important element of, from our perspective, an innovative work policy. And there you have mutual gains. This is finding from our result. These types of work organization, group work here, have mutual gains for firms on the one hand, for the employees on the other hand. If we discuss what that means for society, there will we have another dimension, but for the moment at least, it's very clear that there are mutual gains connected to these democratic practices inside group work. And now I will show you some things more in detail. I will go very quickly through these things, and the details are not important, just to give you an impression how we are working and what are the results. The main results I mentioned before. Work organization profiles by workplace observations and so on, we differentiated between types of work organization. Here means type of group work. And these two elements, team meetings and the role of the team leader or the group speaker, is part of this research we have done. So work organization profile group work can be low, then there are no team meetings, and it's a more as if foreman. It's like a supervisor. The team leader is more like a supervisor. He or she maybe gets more money, has no operational obligations, and so on. So this is the role of team leader on the one hand. On the other hand, you have this, what I mentioned before, an elected spokesperson who works as a co-worker to his or her colleagues. There are regular team meetings, maybe each week. The teams themselves decide what they do under these team meetings, what topics they discuss, and so on. And this is very interesting come from our research. When we made observations on these team meetings, we talked with the people about these two team meetings, we made surveys on these team meetings, and one point was very clear. On this high level, the discourse and the discussion was very much consensus oriented. It was not majority vote. That was very interesting. If groups decide, well, let's discuss 10 minutes and then we make a decision, we vote for a decision. That happens more on maybe on the level 2 or 3, but not on this high level. These groups are very much, well, inclined on consensus, discussing, exchanging, understanding the perspective of these other people, and then come to a decision, and not majority vote. They don't like majority votes in this type of group work. So we have different types of group work. It also has work organizational issues like task integration and so on. That's not that important for the moment. And we have concrete, group works areas, and we can make we can rate them. Where are they? And here is the lowest and the highest types of group work we found in this rating from 1 to 5, which is artificial in a way, but it is heavily based on qualitative research. So we make comparisons, case study comparisons. So that's from 52 case studies. There are groups on the level of 5 or 4 in this direction, and there are also groups very much according to 1 or 2. So there are big differences. And what is important, this is one of the results, these differences explain in a way how working conditions are evaluated by the workers. This is taken from a survey. On the left hand, you have all these different case studies, groups, work areas. In the middle, you have a rating, what's about task integration, how Tayloristic is the work, or how complete is the work. This is from the perspective of the psychology of work, an important point. And this is even more important from our findings, at least, you have the issue of group self-organization. How self-organized is this group really, concerning to team leader, group speaker, and so on, what I mentioned before. Just 3 levels, high, medium, low. And you can see that you have huge differences. And maybe for this question, have your working conditions improved because of group work or deteriorated? Did it get better or worse? All these groups, these areas where they say that it has improved are very much on this level of high level of group self-organization and so on, high level of task integration. And on the other hand, it's everyone on the low side. This is one of the results, and then I skip this. This is just, you can make correlations where you can see that there's a very clear correlation between the work organization and the evaluation of working conditions. Here's a bit more skill level, which type of work and so on. If we go more into details, we will see that there are some differences between assembly work, low skill, and more highly skilled work. But the basic line is very clear, a strong correlation between the level of work, group work, the level of work organization on the one hand, and on the work situation, how the work situation is evaluated, rated by the workers themselves. And we can skip over this. We can also skip over this. And this is the last point concerning group work. This is the research I've done in the late 2000 years in the car industry. That's only car industry in this sample. 20 plants of original equipment manufacturers, of the Toyotas, the Volkswagens, the Fords, and so on, of this Fiats, Renaults, not to forget, and supplier parts, big supplier companies. And so to get at least a bit of an idea how common are these different types of group work, these different types of work organization. And all these plants are in Germany. So what you can see is that there's a spread between these highly based on group self-organization forms and more Tayloristic, more authoritative, more lean production-oriented forms of group work and work organization. When it concerns the spokesperson, Gruppensprecher, or team leader, so these are 9 plants on the one hand, 6 plants on the other hand. Most of them are in the middle. That's very common for social phenomena. And elected team members, or elected by team members is quite often, but you have also these team leaders chosen by supervisors or agreed between team and supervisor. And when it comes to team meetings, you can also see that the high level of self-organization by team members themselves is only, about a third of the groups or the plants. And there are a lot of plants where team meetings exist, but they work in a different way. No team meetings at all, it's very seldom. more often it's organized, dominated by supervisors, or shared responsibility between team and supervisor. Okay, that was my first point, and I have 2 examples to understand what is really going on in these groups and between colleagues, and why it is, or it makes sense to call it democratic practice, but we should discuss this point. I took 2 examples from the qualitative material. One example is planning of vacation, allocation of leave. Second example will be transfer of an employee between work groups. The first example is that there's a decision that is needed, who can go on holiday and how long in a row. That's a very common problem in work groups or in the working life, in the ordinary working life, at least based on firms, based on cooperation and so on. The problem workers have to solve is that almost everybody wants to go during summer on holiday, and especially migrants want to go 3 to 4 weeks in a row, basically to travel to their home countries, visiting their original families and so on. This is a problem to solve for these groups. And what was very interesting in our research is that in these types of high level of group self-organization, groups discussed these problems very clearly. How do we decide? Each gets the same majority vote, whatever. And what was very interesting is that on this high level of group self-organization and based on deliberation, on democratic discussions inside these groups, and they were very much focused on need-based decisions. They have an understanding that there are different needs, and if we take a decision, we have to realize these different needs. But this was connected to a promise of compensation. So you can go maybe in summer for 3 to 4 weeks, but the rest of the year, you have to help us in a specific way. So it's always a do or this. You give and take. This is a very important part of this democratic practices inside group works. And it's a very clear mutuality. This is a very clear thing. If somebody doesn't work according to these principles of mutuality, for example, he or she will get big problems in one of these groups. This is the first example. As a second example is even more interesting because it connects a little bit these different levels of workplace democracy and industrial democracy. The example is a transfer of an employee between work groups. This is, again, a very common problem or a very common situation in working life, that somebody has to leave one group and has to go into another group because of production changes, whatever. The decision that is needed is who should be part of the group and which shift should a new colleague be part of. Often there are 2 or 3 shifts, and when a new colleague has to go to a different area, the question is which shift should he or she go on? And then there's a discussion. Normally, the supervisor decides, the firm decides where to go, but in this example, this is another case study, the group themselves were confronted with this decision and something happened. What happened? The situation completely was that a future colleague was announced by management, but it was a man in this case, he was followed by rumors of being difficult, maybe even less performing, absolutely not properly skilled, at least at the moment, and so on. So there were rumors connected to this person. So the group was very worried. What is happening now? What should we do? And what was very interesting was that the group decided to have a group meeting by themselves, their ordinary group meeting, discussing this point. And they made an appointment with this guy supposed to coming into the group. They made a group meeting with this new colleague, talking to him, discussing with him, and so on. And in the end, and they bargained, they negotiated with the supervisor, with the firm, and they came to the conclusion that they make a tryout period with this new colleague, saying, okay, we have heard something about you, but we give you a chance. We will see. We help you, we tell you how we are working here based on mutuality and so on, and we will see what happens. This was one point. Second point is that they heavily bargained with the supervisor on this issue, telling him that, okay, we take this guy, but then you have to compensate us for that he's not that much skilled, so give us more learning time and so on. And they even decided with the supervisor that the next transfer should go on another shift, because the discussion was on which shift should this guy say. And the one shift say, okay, we take him, but next time we will get someone who is skilled. So next time another shift has to take somebody who is not that skilled and so on. So, and this was based on group discussions inside the group together with the new colleagues, and it was connected to bargaining with the supervisor, with the firm. And even the Works Council was involved in this issue. He knew about the issue, he came into the group meeting, discussed with the group and so on. So there was a connection between this industrial democracy level and the workplace democracy level. So enough about group work. Second part is much shorter because I will not take up the whole discussion about digitization and work, although we have very interesting findings there. I would just put up one issue. This is this point. Again, this is based on case studies, very recent case studies, still ongoing case studies partly. And we found that there are differences between areas, groups of workers concerning the level of co-creation and participation when it comes to technologies and workflow, organization issues and so on. So we have very different situations. Some workers can influence technologies that come into the work process. Some workers, work groups can have a say in which kind of organization and workflow, which changes have to be made there and so on. Again, we made 3 levels, high, medium, low. You can see by the numbers that a high level of co-creation is rather seldom. It's at least less than a quarter of the groups, people having this experience. Mostly it's low, a low level of co-participation or at medium. And again, this is the only thing I want to show you is that the evaluation of the working conditions of the Arbeitssituation is very much connected to this level of co-creation when it comes to digitization. And what's even more important when it comes to issue of health, occupational health, it makes a huge difference whether these people are involved in the organization of technologies or not. So we are, the points are that digital technologies often do not work properly, and that they do not work properly make this work situation worse. And the biggest problems working people have with digitization is that it doesn't work and it doesn't live up to the expectations and the promises which have been made. And the workers has to cope with this situation. And this is one of the important results. And the second one is the figures I already showed to you, that employee influence on digitization based on participation, co-creation makes a difference. And here we are again on the issue of mutual gains. It makes a difference economically, that I did not show you, but there are figures showing this, and for work and health, and even politically, that makes a big difference. So we are at the final conclusion for our discussion. One point is work policies matter. There is no determinism nor technological, economic, managerial, that there are different ways of working, different ways of organizing work, and these different ways of organizing work matter on several issues. Second conclusion is that innovative work policy, that means mutual gains, is a real option. That here we are again on the issue of critique. That's a real option, which is not often taken by firms, but it is a real option. And we as sociologists of work are trying to do research on this issue, which types and what you have to do and so on. But the second point is innovative work policy is a real option. That means mutual gains. Third point is, as I said, workplace democracy is, in this meaning I showed, is an important element of innovative work policies. That means democratic practices are a base or a feeding ground for mutual gains. And when it comes to workplace democracy and industrial democracy, based on co-determination, works council, as I mentioned before, my finding or my impression is that these two things are mutually reinforcing, workplace democracy and industrial democracy, and they should go hand in hand, that you have to develop both. This is not easy for unions, for example. Unions feel very comfortable with industrial democracy, but quite often not very comfortable with workplace democracy. So there's a lot of tension in this idea, but our finding at least is that they can go hand in hand and they should go hand in hand. Why? Workplace democracy extends industrial democracy into daily working life, into the experience of employees. It is backing, or the workplace democracy is backing industrial democracy as a power resource, even as a cultural resource. How do you work? How do you discuss? What are you doing? And even motivationally. So workplace democracy is, well, in a way of backing of industrial democracy. And last point is workplace democracy is well, it's grounding, it's often focusing, but especially visualizing and stimulating industrial democracy. Those case studies we made where these come together, industrial democracy and workplace democracy, it was very stimulating for industrial democracy, having this, well, base of workplace democracy. Looking from the other side, industrial democracy is backing workplace democracy too, as a power resource, for example, because industrial democracy has power, has influence on the firm level, and therefore it's a backing resource for workplace democracy having this. And at least also, sometimes it's even more important, it's the issue of knowledge resource. So industrial work councils are a knowledge resource for employees dealing with doings around workplace democracy. And last point is that industrial democracy extends and channels issues of workplace democracy on higher levels, firms, even unions. So there's an important, well, function, an important role of industrial democracy. So, and the final issue I want to make, and this is more a question, not that much a finding from our research, but I think there's a bit of evidence that the combination of workplace democracy and industrial democracy has a democratizing effect in and on society. If you understand democracy as a way of life, if you have an understanding of democracy that it's a learning arrangement, and if you have this idea of democracy, then this combination of direct democracy, which workplace democracy is, and representative democracy, which industrial democracy is, this combination has a democratizing effect even on society, since working life still is a major part of a lot of people in the Western, and not only in the Western world. Thanks. So maybe I skipped the slides. If there are any questions, I can take them again.
Martin, you want to maybe stop sharing the screen so everybody is more like can see each other, and I can also do the...
I'm just working on to
okay,
get rid of the. Actually, I don't know why it doesn't work.
You should have a green button with sharing screen in the bottom of your Zoom.
Yeah, I know, but
doesn't. Maybe Alexander, you can also.
Yeah, I overruled. I'm sorry.
Yeah, thanks. Overruling sometimes is very helpful.
I think we got some questions already. I don't know who was first, so I'm probably going to start with.
The first on the top is the first, and then they follow one after the other. So you can follow the order from top to the bottom.
Then we got Stefan Berger first.
Yeah, thank you very much, Martin. I think it's really fascinating talk, very intriguing for a historian, also interesting. I have a couple of questions. One, it wasn't quite clear to me, your empirical data, what kind of research do they come out of? Is it kind of questionnaires? Is it kind of ethnographic research? Is it more quantitative, more qualitative? Maybe you could say a little bit more about the basis from which these kind of data are extrapolated. And then, I mean, secondly, I also wondered the question about your empirical work. In a way, I wasn't quite sure, what does it tell us about group work and its effects on the position of the employee in the factory? Because maybe this is too simplistic. My thinking is too simplistic, but you know, I'm thinking of Walter Müller-Jentsch's famous description of social partnership as a conflict partnership. You have the employer who basically has the interest of profit maximization and creating surplus value out of labor. So, you know, through forms of exploitation, and you have the employee who is interested in good pay and good working conditions. And that usually runs counter to the questions of profit maximization. So you have this kind of basic conflict of interest. And where does group work stand in this basic conflict of interest that we have at the factory level? And if I may, a third point, I was really intrigued about your general conclusions and the specific empirical data. How do you get from one to the other? Because you know the specifics, if I recall it correctly, was about digitization and work, and it was about in a way the effects of group work, but the conclusions are sort of very generally coming up with very positive assessment of group work that work towards workplace democracy and have even a kind of democratizing effect on society. And I thought the connection, for me at least, between the two wasn't quite there.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to explain a bit more.
Yes, please.
These are three heavy questions. I should answer directly.
Yeah, makes more.
So maybe some of you have the same question anyhow. Data and methods, it's pure mixed methods. The base is always workplace observations. In most of our cases, we are several weeks on a plant together with the workers from the morning in the evening and so on, talking to them, looking what they are doing, but especially talking to them. Because when you talk in the real work situation, or you talk in a different way as when you make an interview. But again, we also make interviews and we make surveys. This is well, it's very common, not in every study I'm doing and all my colleagues are doing, but in a lot of our studies, we are combining these qualitative interviews, observations with surveys. Because by qualitative research, you always get ideas about how people can think and may think, but you can't really get an understanding on other majorities or minorities, what is common, what is not common, and you can't make correlations. Because when it comes to group work, there was a huge discussion. Group work is for younger, qualified people and men, and older people, not that qualified people, and women are the losers of group work concept. This was the debate a lot. And elderly people don't want group work and so on. And only by making these correlations, you can get a better grip on the issue. Because of course you find older people liking group work and you find older people not liking group work. So it's basically in a lot of our cases is mixed methods, both qualitative and quantitative, and very much this is this hermeneutic tradition we have, which is very important, at least for the Göttingen sociology of work, but also for other sociologists of work. Maybe we are the most classical in this way, but there are other German and not only German sociologists which are trying to mixing these two things. This is the first point. The second point, effects on group work on the employees. Well, our basic point is, and then the issue of conflict partnership, Miller-Jensch. The basic point is, and this was a very special view or finding, our view is there are different types of group work, teamwork. In the 90s, when this discussion started, it was a discussion, what is group work? Is this way or that way? And a bit your question was from this perspective, what is group work? Is it capitalism at its highest level, alienating everybody who can't imagine something else outside the way of work? This is a Japanese lean production concept. Everybody goes with the firm, so to say. Or is it something else? Our result, and this is really a finding from our research, that you have to look very closely on the type, the forms of group work. And then you have very different effects. And the point which is interesting for your discussion is that these democratic practices, or which I labeled democratic practices, it may be discussed whether it makes sense to label them as democratic practices. But these democratic practices, like electing spokespeople, like having a team meeting in a specific way of discussing, deliberating about problems, having a bit of say on specific issues, not on everything, of course, but on specific issues, like, for example, who can go on leave in the summer and so on. These make a huge difference. This was very interesting for us, and it was, at that time at least, a very important finding from our research. So the basic conflict between capital and labor still exists, of course, but it's not that easy. It's not that easy that under capitalism, things can only get worse. And on the other hand, if you overthrow capitalism, everything will be better. This is our sociology of work perspective. You have to look very closely how work is organized. Are there any democratic practices in the daily doings, in the ordinary working life? And then, and this was interesting for us, there are possibilities for mutual gains. Hopefully I made clear that's not majority that these are some examples of mutual gains. And this is not how history goes, so to say. So in the end, capitalism again makes working life bad and worse, but there is not real utopia. So it might be different. And this is the issue of critique again. This is at least my understanding of sociology of work, to put critique on the table, but not from the outside, but from the inside, looking what people are doing, talking with people, systemizing what is going on. So this is, well, the third question is answered, I think, again, this positive assessment. It is based on empirical research, but not all types are positive. And the issue of democratic practices in society, there was a question mark in the end. Maybe it was not clear enough. It's not empirical evidence I have. It's some evidence I have, and I have some theoretical arguments that it might be that case. The first point, this is evidence, this combination of workplace democracy and industrial democracy, that they can go hand in hand, that they should go hand in hand if you have a specific view on working life, and how these dynamics between workplace and industrial democracy, these channels, this is evidence-based, because we always talk with the works councils, with management, and so on. So this is not an idea, these are findings, but the last point is an idea.
So I think Roberto is next.
It was Giulio, actually.
Oh, Giulio, oh, sorry. Okay, Giulio.
Well, thanks, Martin. Very interesting presentation. I'm an economist, so I have to say I found interesting, parallels with your framework. And I just wanted to point out two elements, which are a bit also questions. The first one is the fact that in your distinction between industrial and the workplace, I think there is an interesting parallel with the logic of micro and institutional or corporate governance type of issues. So in that respect, I was wondering whether you had the opportunity to do case studies in non-fully capitalist firms, such as cooperatives or not-for-profits, because there is quite a large, discussion about that, whether not just the legal form, but the organization of the firm with regard to the power related to the participation of decision-making relates the micro and the firm level. And so in other terms, economists know that in general, that should be the logic of creation of different kind of firms. So from the point of view of sociology, I think would be interested to complement this idea, knowing that some large cooperatives, for instance, do not have a very large degree of participation. And so there could be nuances in this distinction. So in other terms, that I think is an interesting point, but in that respect too, empirically, it would, from an economic viewpoint, as you know, there is evidence about performances like, employment of larger employment and so on. So in a way, linking also to Stefan's point, I think some more empirically based type of evidence would be relevant. The second observation is the fact that in your distinction, I think one can also find a behavioral element of the relevance of democracy in firms. In other terms, with other colleagues, we've presented a bit of work of experiments in firms or in generally the behavioral perception of workers or what is going on within a firm. So in that respect too, I think a parallel is the fact that just by the way in which firms are organized conceptually, we cannot say ex ante whether people actually perceive the organization differently or not, because it is how they actually experience that type of framework. So in general, I think it could be useful to find common themes, but the emphasis on the empirical aspect and also on the performances, I think, would get closer these two lines of reasoning. Thank you.
I can make a quick remark. I did not have the chance to do research on collaboratives and so on. I discussed a bit with colleagues, and I know a bit of the literature about these issues. Wolfgang Weber, of course, would be a person which we should have on board just now for this really discussing. But I didn't have done research on this issue. This is the first. And the second one, it is, well, it's very in line with my thinking and my findings that you have to really look on how people orientations are, how they realize what's going on and so on. And the issue of performance is very interesting because as sociologists, we can't really measure performance, but I know that even economists can't really measure performance because there's a huge discussion how to measure performance. And we made it in one of our projects. We had a collaboration with economists working exactly on these issues of performance, trying, because we were asked, okay, you have these types of work policy. Can you really show what's the connection towards performance? And we had companies on board, which were very open, said, yes, let's see, can we measure performance effects and so on. The result was it isn't possible because performance, when you take it really on firms, is a very loose concept, a very multi-faced concept. And so in the end, we made a research in this way that we asked managers and supervisors, do these groups perform, do these areas perform better than before, after introduction of these types of work organization? And we made it with a concept on quality, on a lot of different elements of performance. And this is a small result, and I still would be very calm about the issue of performance. I know these types of work organization and work policy are performing, but I won't say that they are performing always and even better than a more traditional or more Tayloristic work organization. That's something you economists should deal with. Thank you, out of my range.
Okay, so Roberto, I think you're next on the list.
So I also have maybe 3 questions which are more or less also comments. And so from a political theoretical standpoint, it's clear that what happens in this teamwork has to do with democracy, because the kind of language you mobilize clearly points to democratic interaction. You've been mentioning collective self-determination, deliberation, mutuality, which calls for solidarity, which typically had a democratic value, and equality. So it's clear that there is something there which has to do with democracy, which happens. And the 3 questions related to this I wanted to ask you are these. One is whether the actors you meet in these places, do they have a normative language of this some kind? Do they use the term democracy, or do they use other terms, and or is it something imposed from the scholar, the scientist? This is the first question. The second one is, you know, there is this literature who tries to figure out which kind of democratic practices have the higher impact on workers' well-being, whether it is a higher level representation through like Mitbestimmung, or whether it is participation into works councils, or my question, whether it is working in teamwork. So I wanted to know whether you did some inquiry into which kind of all these are democratizing practices, whether you did some research on which have the stronger impact on workers' well-being or workers' self-awareness. I mean, you choose the level. And the third one related to this is whether in your inquiry you found some correlation between the type of companies which are better at implementing level 5 teamwork practices and other institutional features more classically democratic in the sense of economic or industrial democracy. In other words, when in the companies where you find the best examples of teamwork are also the company who have co-determination and the works council and other things, or not?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I take the third one first, and then, because the first question is the most difficult and even the most interesting one, but take the easier questions first. Yes, it is that way, that companies having more of this type of workplace democracy are also much more ingrained in institutions of industrial democracy, are more common to industrial democracy, have stronger works councils and so on. Even works councils have more say in these companies, at least in Germany, I would say so. And in Scandinavia, I know a lot of Scandinavian companies, that's basically the same situation. I can't say anything about American companies and so on. In these surroundings, it is this way. And it is important because workplace democracy in this sense was very much, this is the second question, a bit of second question, was very much influenced by union discussions. So it's not company, or quite often it's not companies by themselves implementing these types of work organization. It has been companies together with works councils and unions negotiating about, for example, lean production, and then came to these types of solutions. So therefore there is a connection empirically, but also by what happens, by the dynamics. There's a close connection between these two levels when how it comes. On the other hand, democracy is a dangerous concept. Management avoids the language of democracy. There is just for 1 or 2 years, Thomas Sattelberger, is a former manager and so on. He's a proponent of the democratic firm in managerial discourse and so on. But this is a very recent phenomenon that a management actor, or at least a management-oriented actor, he's not longer a manager, that he actively proposes the idea of a democratic firm. But this is the exception in a way. Normally, democracy is a dangerous word when it comes to management in firms. So they don't use the language of democracy concerning these types of elected spokespeople, for example. Sometimes they even say that, well, that's not the first step towards democracy. That makes sense to have elected spokespeople, but not because we follow democratic principles or so. And on other places, one of the huge counterparts of these types of work organization come from the fear of democracy, which is very common in management still. That's in that way, the split between capital and labor still exists, of course. So, but the really interesting issue and the complicated issue is, what do employees, workers themselves think about democracy? And since we were talking with them a lot of times and so on, democracy is not their primary language for what happens. The primary language is solidarity, is to find a consensual solution, is to be a good colleague, to find a solution that works for everybody. So this is the language of the workers, of the employees. When they act, when they produce, when they use democratic procedures, it's not the big issue of democracy. It's more the daily issue of getting something done together, cooperate, finding solutions that work even in the longer run, not just for the moment because somebody has the strongness and so on. So this is the language of the people. And very seldom you have workers, ordinary workers, really talking about democracy. I had a Croatian worker in one of these interviews talking about that his complete way of thinking changed. His relation inside the family changed, how he talks with his children and so on. And he related all this to these experiences he had, discussing things, electing spokespeople and so on, having roles to everybody. It's not somebody who is doing everything, but everybody takes part in something and so on. But this is seldom, very rare. The language of democracy comes in from the union side. The IG Metall, the German metal workers union, they very actively proposed the issue of group work under the headline of more democracy. And even what I mentioned in the late 60s, 1960s, Mitbestimmung am Arbeitsplatz, that was at that time a very clear concept, getting democracy broader inside society. So that was, at least in Germany, it was the years of, well, dare more democracy and so on. So this issue of Mitbestimmung am Arbeitsplatz at that time was very closely related to democracy, but it was a union question, a leftist politicians question and so on. It was not the ordinary workers' language at that time. And still today, it's not the ordinary language of the workers.
So I got Stefan Berger again.
Sorry, yeah,
Okay.
I find it's really fascinating. And Martin, what you just said, again, you know that the Böckler Stiftung is currently funding these research projects on Arbeitszeitpolitiken, and one of it, I think, is located at the Sophie in Göttingen. And the preliminary findings there, I'm on the advisory board, and one of the preliminary findings is that all of the campaigns of the unions on Arbeitszeitpolitik, so the more time for family, and the posters with sort of sunshine and grass and happy families, and that this is sort of nowhere reflected in the interview data that they are compiling amongst workers. So the huge difference between the union positions and the positions of ordinary workers, which seems to reflect what you just said about the IG Metall very much campaigning on workplace democracy, and for the workers, democracy being really a rather kind of abstract thing that they do not connect to group work, and that they have different kind of values like solidarity, like what works in practice, and which is a kind of problem when we come from the perspective of workplace democracy. I would say, because it's clearly not anchored in the language and the thinking and the mental world of many workers. And if I may, I think what was I going to say? Sorry, now I've forgotten. Over all of my enthusiasm over these last remarks, I've forgotten what I really wanted to ask. Sorry, I'll shut up. Maybe it will come back to me.
Come back again. But to give a historical remark to your remark is very interesting, because this concept of Mitbestimmung am Arbeitsplatz, workplace democracy, that was, well, discussed in the late 60s, 1960s, partly by the church, people working in the church, because not the Catholic Church, but the other one, and it was discussed by left unionists, this idea of Mitbestimmung am Arbeitsplatz. But at that time, it doesn't get drowned at that time, because there was fear that ordinary workers might be not that, maybe we don't trust them. It's better to have unionists on the workplace. This is one reason, but more important was the issue of working times, for example, because in the late 60s, it was just the first working time debate, not the 35 hours, but it's 5 days a week. On Saturday, Daddy is Mine was a famous poster at that time. And so at that time, in the late 60s, Mitbestimmung am Arbeitsplatz, which means workplace democracy, didn't get ground because unions
were fighting for working time reduction, and this is even more important when it comes to the issue of democracy, they were fighting at that time for industrial democracy, because the Co-Determination Act, which give a lot of say to unions, and which is very particular for Germany, it came in the 70s. So in the late 60s, German unions, especially the IG Metall and the DGB, the overall union, they fighted for industrial democracy, and therefore they had not much idea and power towards workplace democracy. This is historically, I think,
we can take it back even further historically, because we go to the Weimar Republic when the works councils were first introduced. At least the social democratic trade unions were impeccably opposed to works councils. But now I remember the question. The question is whether this kind of research that you are doing, in the results, it seems to confirm, if you like, a particular way of conceptualizing workplace democracy that is home in Rhinish capitalism. You know, so it's a research on Germany, which kind of, rather than being sort of critique, it seems to legitimate the kind of corporatist industrial relations that we have in Germany. Therefore, my question is, do we have similar research in other countries, or is this a very German research tradition?
Yeah. Yes, I can answer directly. Hopefully it just not only legitimized Rhinish capitalism, corporatist, because from my perspective, it extends Rhinish, and it extends, or it should, or it could extend corporatist arrangements, because corporatist arrangements are representative democracy. And the issue of workplace, maybe I was not clear enough. Issue of workplace is direct democracy. This is one answer. The second answer is Scandinavia. You have exactly the same situation. You have union movements. It's a bit different between Denmark and Sweden and Norway and so on. But basically, you have union movements which have some sort of co-determination, industrial democracy in a different way. There are differences. And at the same time, always have and had a strong focus on workplace democracy. So it's not just a German phenomenon. But of course, Scandinavia and Germany are somewhat similar when it comes to corporatist arrangements and so on.
And there is similar research pointing in the same direction as the research is pointing in Germany for Scandinavia.
Yeah, basically, yes. Well, I have to differentiate. When it comes to the issue of work, how work affects and so on, it's the same issue. When it comes to the issue of connection of industrial democracy and workplace democracy, that's not so pronounced in the Scandinavian research. The basic idea is there too, and if you talk to unionists or leftist researchers, they have basically the same ideas, but it's not the mainstream. In Scandinavia, it's more quality of working life. This issue is much more important, and it's not that much. But basically, it's the same understanding. Yes.
So next on the list is Philip.
Thanks. I would like to go back to the issue of performance, but more from the perspective of employees themselves. And at least some of the tools of workplace democracy that you mentioned were introduced at critical times, when workers or employees understood that there was a lot of pressure, competition for their products, also in global markets. And now when I compare this to, I've been studying notions of workplace democracy among mostly British workers in the interwar period. And for them, the single most important issue was that they could participate democratically in the election of their foreman. So that was sort of the most important thing, because they said we want to work in a democratically organized firm, but we're also not naive. We understand that this is a complex industry, and we need someone who has the authority to say, this is what we're going to do. So only then can we be effective and work competitively in a privately organized industry. So I wonder what role did this play for the people that you interviewed? That would they say that this is important, so we stay in the market and we stay competitive in a global market, or was this not important at all?
Oh, well, that's an interesting point. Basically, I would say not only German workers. Workers by definition, I would try to say, workers by definition are concerned about competition, about competitiveness, about firms have to earn money and so on. All of my research and even research of other people show that workers, employees are very pragmatic. And you won't find a lot of critique of capitalism on this general level when you talk to workers. Even historical, you can show that it's often not the case, that the very strong criticism of capitalism doesn't come from ordinary workers. So this is one answer. Ordinary workers are very much aware of competition, of firms have to be profitable and so on, and German unions too. That's very one of the specifics of German unions, that they are very aware of this point. This is one answer. The second answer is when it comes to foremen, to supervisors. This is a very interesting case because these types of group works didn't try to elect foremen supervisors. Foremen supervisors still exist. And there was, both on the union side, on the workers' side, and on the management side, there was, from examples, well, maybe basically there was no idea that it makes sense to elect supervisors and foremen, but not, that might be a difference to the British situation. British situation is quite different in a lot of ways. But not because the German workers had the idea that there should be somebody to say what's going on and so on. So they are anti-authority oriented, but they say foremen supervisors are necessary, are important, and they should not be elected. But what they say, and this is maybe the German answer to this issue of foremen supervisors in these types of workplace democracy arrangements, they said the supervisors should have a different role. That's the important point. They said, we don't need a supervisor on the shop floor. We don't need somebody saying us what to do. They say, but we need a supervisor close to our group, who really is has a blue collar background as a Meister, the German expression is Meister. We need someone like this to get influence into the firm. So when you talk to these groups, there was the impression of the foreign minister, as Außenminister. Some of these groups said, we need foremen for our working, daily working and so on, but we need an Außenminister, a foreign minister. And the supervisor, the foreman, is our foreign minister. Or another ordinary expression was, it's good to have someone from the military, someone with more stars and so on on the shoulder. It's good to have somebody with more influence, more power near to you, which you can take influence on in firm. So this was a discussion and inside these types of group work, not about electing these people, but having them not elected, because then you have more power towards the firm.
So I think
so it's a power issue. It's very much a power issue. And maybe the British workers have different concepts of power. Their own power, the power of the firm, and so on.
Just clarify that this was in the 1920s.
So Martin, you want to respond to that, or should I go on with the last question?
The 1920s? No.
Okay.
I don't know whether...
It was not a question. It was just, I was just saying to clarify that this was in the 1920s.
Yeah.
Okay, so Roberto is next.
Yeah, it's a question. I mean, I would require maybe half an hour to have an answer, but maybe I just throw it like this. I was wondering whether you had an hypothesis concerning why German trade unions moved from an industrial democracy to a workplace democracy position, and how this was connected to the reinterpretation, if you want, of some key managerial concepts like lean management typically, but also lots of other concepts which were coming from the Japanese automotive industry and which had nothing within them. I mean, they were undemocratic in their basis, but it seems to me, if I understand you, that it was trade unions who accepted this level of discussing about the workplace organization through this ideology of managerial ideology and redemocratize it. So change the normative meaning of it, and at the same time endorsing themselves this workplace democracy level, which they rejected earlier. So it seemed like quite a complex interconnection of different levels of events. So I just wanted to have your view on this, why it happened this way.
Mm-hmm. Well, the historical process is very clear from my perspective. German unions, at least the IG Metall, you have to very clear about which union you are talking about, which type of workers you are talking about. So there are differences, of course. But, well, in a way, the IG Metall is a dominant union still, and that at that time even more than today, because Verdi now is roughly at the same level when it comes to power. But it's the IG Metall concept, workplace democracy, group work, and so on. So in the IG Metall, there always has been this tradition, starting from as I said, from the 1960s. But it was not very high on the agenda of the union, and the historical circumstances were not in the way to get this really effective and so on. And this changed in the 1980s already. There were people talking about these types of group work, influencing workplace democracy and so on. And then lean production happened. And this is very funny because we were exactly at that time in the car industry with a big research project, not on group work that came a bit later, but on other issues. And at that time, when the MIT study, which published and which influenced the lean production debate, coming with the result that Toyota, or other way around, that Mercedes-Benz, the Sindelfingen plant, needs as much workers or working time to fix cars that has not been properly built, need as much time for this than Toyota for producing the car. These were numbers. The issue of performance these were the numbers which the lean production study gave into the industry, and the most people thought, yes, it's true. It's maybe not that far from performance, but it's true. The Japanese, especially Toyota, is much more performing than other car companies. That was the discussion at the beginning of the 90s, and then a very funny thing happened. Because then there was a discussion, we have to have lean production in Germany too. And there was a discussion, what is lean production? A lot of elements. And one element is teamwork. And one element is team meetings. And then the union said, yes, teamwork and team meetings is a good idea. Let's bargaining, let's negotiate in this. And our understanding of team working is elected group spokesperson, team meetings organized by teams themselves. So, and then at several German car makers, it went in this direction. Team meetings, self-organized, and so on and so on. But it was
all the time struggle about these issues. And in the, it's very clear in my mind, later on, a lot of managers said that was not true. In the beginning of the 90s, we thought that the Japanese have team meetings, self-organized by teams and team leaders in this way. And then afterwards they realized, no, that was not true. This is a more top-down position. And the meetings are very much structured and so on. And then was a wave of rolling back to teamwork, group work in Germany. So the historical process is quite clear from my perspective. And lean production had a huge impact at that time, because these types of work organizations spread from the car industry into other industries.
So we got 1 minute left and one question. Martin, you still want to take it? Okay, then Selina, you can go.
Hello, thank you very much for the very interesting talk. I just have to again ask this just because maybe I have a different perspective on this because I'm from the field of philosophy. I was just wondering, and maybe I didn't really get it right, or maybe there's a difference in like the disciplines. So I just, from my standpoint, I wonder where the difference is between self-organized works councils by like the workers themselves, because like works councils is kind of like different to like the unions. So like they can also be without the unions, organize a works council in like every firm in Germany with 5 employees. So in what sense is it different to like groups work that is maybe even installed by like the owner of the firm or the management or who else? So I think at least from my standpoint as a philosopher, I would say this is more of a democratic process than like the management introducing top-down, you can do group work and decide on certain decisions, while the Works Council can itself has the rights to decide on certain decisions without the acceptance of the management.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. There's the power relations are different between workplace democracy in the form of these self-organized groups and works councils. That's true. That's the case. Works councils mostly are union-based, and the point is, again, which type of group work do you have? Because even when group work is imposed by management, then you might have this type of 1 or 2 in our differentiation. If it is, even if it is introduced by management, having elected spokespeople and so on, this type more 4 or 5, even if it is introduced by management, it doesn't work on the premises of management because it gives real power to the employees. And therefore, there is still a difference towards the Works Council, because the Works Council has legal obligations, has legal power, and so on. I think it's important to point these points out. But when it comes to, and the similarity, of course, is that the Works Council is elected by the workers and by the employees. So it's, again, a democratic procedure. But still, that's at least our finding, that in some forms of group work, you have real democratic procedures, real democratic practices, although they might be introduced by management. Although, as I said, the real democratic practices in group work are often introduced by management and Works Council. That's the issue of democracy. You know, management has a natural fear of democracy. That still holds true. So in the most cases which were on this high level, unions played a role, Works Councils played a role, and so on. So it's very seldom, maybe in a cooperative,
but it's very seldom that management totally by itself introduce these types of group work. What you do have is that unions or works councils work against this type of workplace democracy because it might be uncomfortable to them because it's real authority to ordinary workers, like the decision, for example, who goes on holidays and so on. That's maybe something which the Works Council would think that it's his or her obligation to decide if there's a conflict, of course.
Yeah, true. I totally see also this difference between the participation part of like everyone in the firm, and then on the other hand, this institutional part, maybe when democratic structures are like in place and people can actually have the right to decide or build a works council and stuff. I would just, from my perspective, say it's two parts of like democratic structures. But yeah, it's very interesting, and thank you very much for the interesting talk.
Yeah. And an important point even for theoretical discussion is industrial democracy is backed by law. At least in Germany, it's backed by law. Of course, powers plays a role even there, but basically it's backed by law. Workplace democracy, in the sense I showed, is backed by negotiation, by daily practices and so on. Again, it's an issue of power relations, of course, but that's an important difference, of course, theoretically at least.
So I think we run out of time, and we should give a big thanks to Martin for this very interesting talk and the lively discussion. And yeah, so one last point before you all leave. We got one final seminar before we do a little summer break, and it's going to be on the 10th of June, and we got as a speaker David Keepley, and he's going to talk about the myth of stockholder ownership and the new case for workplace democracy. So you're all invited, of course, and we're happy to see you all again.
Okay, I will send the slides to you, Alexander, so you can distribute them in a way.
That's great.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.